Don't get me started on the woke vandalism of the English language, the idea that we should all be more inclusive by excluding all manner of totally harmless words and phrases from our collective vocabulary. Now, there was once a time when this madness was limited to the universities, but it's spread. And one of the ways it's spread has been through the so-called human resources industry, who are inflicting all manner of politically correct idiocy on us in the workplace. In this weekend's edition of the Spectator Australia, columnist and occasional guest editor Rebecca Weisser writes about why, thanks to the Morrison government's embrace of wokeness, it's about to get a whole lot worse. Let's chat to her now. Rebecca Weisser, how are you?
It's lovely to be here, Gideon.
Great to have you back. So let's get right into it. Talk me through the craziness that the Morrison government is unleashing when it comes to this new HR-driven compliance culture, domination of our workplaces.
To start with, obviously, there has been this inquiry by the Australian Human Rights Commission and recommendations. And so far, the government has said that it will accept all 55 recommendations, at least in principle. So I guess there's some wiggle room in some of that. And what I would say is, obviously, this is not just like a green field where we're coming into this area for the first time. In fact, you know, the Sex Discrimination Act was introduced in 1984. And so it is illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of sex, and indeed for many other reasons in the workplace. So you might think, well, what are we doing? And that's a very good question. I think if you were, and to try to give the government the benefit of the doubt, and certainly they've talked about this, there is so much legislation and there are so many different recommendations and diktats at, you know, state and federal level and so forth, that it's extremely confusing for employers and difficult. If this were an opportunity to simplify and clarify what was going on, then there could be something good perhaps to come out of this. So if you look at what happens with employers at the moment, employers under the existing legislation may find someone to be sexually harassing somebody else and dismiss them. But then on appeal, it comes back. So employers can be caught in a very difficult situation, and oftentimes, regardless of the merits of the case, can end up having to pay money, because that's what conciliation at the Human Rights Council so often commission seems to come down to. If you look at the cases, many of them involve employers paying money. So I think if this initiative were an opportunity for employers to say, look, this is driving us nuts, with the best will in the world, we are ending up just having to pay out go away money and so forth. Can you simplify this? Can you make it clearer and easier? That could be a good thing to come out of it. But to be honest, some of the language that's being used at the moment, the idea, oh, you can't say things like chuck like a girl, it seems kind of hopeless. You know, that I don't think is going to benefit anyone.
Yeah, it may be simplifying things, but you also have these things built into it, like extending effectively the statute of limitations when it comes to sexual harassment complaints. And yeah, what can happen to you in a workplace now if you say something like, well, you throw like a girl?
Who knows in which particular workplace? I mean, the minister, Senator Michaela Cash, gave this as an example of the kind of language that had to be stamped out. Now, I don't know whether that was because she had looked at it in particular, but to me, that just raised how vague and how unoffensive language can be and yet be deemed unacceptable. I mean, let's think about it. You know, there are physiological differences between the male body and the female body, some of those predisposed benefits to either sex. Now, throwing a ball may or may not be associated with a particular structure in the arm. Let's not get caught up in saying if people throw a ball well or badly that it may have a physiological basis to it. You know, it's just crazy. And I think the net effect of it is that people end up having to self-censor. They're too frightened to say anything. And indeed, the Prime Minister himself said that he listened to a couple an elderly couple at a sporting match, and one said to the other, "You can't say that anymore." And he gave that as a good example. I mean, this idea that people are sort of censoring themselves and censoring their husband or wife, I mean, I just feel like, who's going to want to go to the workplace?
We can use common sense with this kind of stuff. We can say that, unwanted sexual attention, sexual harassment, that is wrong, that is bad. Of course, employers should be acting to prevent that. But when you get down to the level of, off-colour jokes and little axioms like that, I mean, that defeats the purpose of what this anti-sexual harassment stuff is really trying to achieve, doesn't it?
Well, I think one of the things that I think is a really dangerous unintended consequence is that more and more employers will be nervous about employing women. If you look at the Human Rights Commission again, so many of the claims related to women in relation to pregnancy and so forth, and you sort of think, what is this going to do? Employers are going to get to the point where they have a perfectly good applicant, happens to be female, and they're starting to feel worried, gosh, what could happen down the track? That is exactly the opposite of what you want. So it seems to me that this could be very much a case of be careful what you wish for.
This is a bugbear of mine, the HRisation of the workplace. This again, as I said, you go from acceptable limits to bad behaviour, which we can all agree on as a matter of common decency, versus behaviour codes, strict limits on what you can say, what you can't say, self-censorship. It's not making us any happier or more harmonious, is it? And as you said, it's not exactly advancing the cause of women.
Well, and there's just so much disagreement about what language is acceptable or is unacceptable, what people get offended about, and whether they have a right to be offended. And if they supposedly have a right to be offended, what is the appropriate remedy? Funny how at the Human Rights Commission, the appropriate remedy always seems to be fistful of dollars, Why is that? What about, for example, people who object. One person at the Human Rights Commission, I remember, who objected to somebody else suggesting that he might like black tea. And he took that to be sort of a racist joke at his expense. You can't believe it. But this went on at the Human Rights Commission for years and years. And you have to ask yourself, well, who benefits? You're right. Human rights, the commission obviously benefits. It gives it something to do. Lawyers, they benefit from it, and HR departments. There's a whole industry that grows up around this. And it's one thing for a large company to carry this as a relatively minor percent of their business, but for small business, it's a nightmare.
It is a nightmare for small business and for working people as well, and people who work particularly in offices and places like that. We're already seeing people are self-censoring at work. We're already seeing people are afraid of being hauled before the HR committee for telling, an off-collar joke and things like that. We're already seeing people aren't going to the pub with their colleagues after work because firms are stopping serving alcohol at Christmas parties and things like that. It's just making people more and more miserable. And then these are the same people, these HR types, these consultants, these panic merchants, they're the same people who then turn around and say, we are facing a loneliness epidemic. Well, no wonder, isn't it? Because we're all so miserable and we can't talk to each other.
Exactly. There are so many reasons now to fear other people, whether it's the germs or they might say something you don't like. And there's a whole narrative that is built around suggesting that people are fragile and weak and that they can't cope and that they might be triggered. And it's very interesting, if you're old enough like me to have lived through earlier iterations of these ideas, one thing you can say about feminism, for example, in the 70s and in the 80s, was that it was really about the idea of empowering women. And the feminists would say, we can do anything, I can go anywhere. I demand the right to be able to walk alone at night. And it was a message about women being strong, being capable, being able to do whatever they wanted to do, being able to exercise choice. And fast forward all these decades, and it seems to be the exact opposite. Oh, my goodness, somebody said something. Well, I can't possibly cope with that myself. or, I better get a lawyer. I feel so triggered and upset. I mean, on the one side, you see it being, frankly, and let's leave aside the genuine cases. I think all of us recognize that there are genuine cases, but there are also things where you think, really, is this being milked for money? Is this benefiting the lawyer, the commissioner, the HR person, everybody, but the person who's being accused of the wrongdoing, and perhaps the employer. And that's another interesting thing about this shift, is it's meant to be more about, the emphasis is on the employer to create a safe workspace. It's interesting because that actually has always been there, going right back to the 1980s and 1984 legislation. But you can see that the emphasis, so now, it's not just that there's some, serial pest in the office who's making people's lives a misery. It's all the employer's fault. And when the employer tries to get rid of such a person, it's very, very hard.
That's right. And I think you nailed it perfectly. Look, I'm not a woman. I don't identify as a woman, but I think there's a great point in all of this, because unlike, say, second wave feminism, which demanded equal social rights to women and really did say women should be able to be anywhere a man can be, work anywhere a man can be, do whatever a man can do. This is infantilizing women. It's insisting on safe spaces and that everybody censor themselves and create a completely inoffensive environment. And it's not doing the cause of women any good. It's not doing anybody any good. And it'll just make people crazy and make people rise up against it. But in the meantime, Rebecca Weisser, thank you so much for joining us here on CounterCulture today. Keep writing. Always love your articles in the Spectator Australia and your editions of the Spectator Australia as well. So we'll see you again very soon.
It's a pleasure, Kitty.